His magnum opus, Being and Time, and his many essays and lectures profoundly influenced subsequent movements in European philosophy, including existentialism, hermeneutics, deconstruction, and critical theory. His influence has extended far beyond the bounds of academic philosophy, inspiring theorists in fields as diverse as theology, anthropology, sociology, psychology, aesthetics, literary criticism, political science, strategic management, and cognitive science. Yet beneath this towering influence lies a philosophical project of extraordinary depth and complexity. Heidegger sought nothing less than to overturn the entire tradition of Western metaphysics and to open up a new way of thinking about the most fundamental question of philosophy, the question of being itself. This was not merely an academic exercise, but a quest to retrieve what he saw as a forgotten dimension of human existence, a primordial understanding of what it means to be that had been covered over by centuries of philosophical and scientific thinking. Heidegger's philosophy unfolds like a vast archaeological expedition into the foundations of Western thought. He excavates layer after layer of accumulated philosophical assumptions, seeking to uncover the original Greek experience of being that he believed had been lost since the time of Plato and Aristotle. His work represents both a destruction of traditional metaphysics and a creative retrieval of more originary possibilities for thinking. The journey through Heidegger's complete philosophy reveals a thinker who transforms every concept he touches. Truth becomes unconcealment rather than correspondence. Time becomes the horizon for understanding being rather than a sequence of now moments. Human existence becomes Dasein, the being for whom being is a question rather than a rational animal or thinking substance. Technology reveals itself as a way of revealing being rather than mere tools and machines. Language becomes the house of being rather than an instrument of communication. To understand Heidegger means to undergo a fundamental reorientation in thinking. It requires abandoning the familiar subject-object framework that has dominated Western philosophy since Descartes. It demands a willingness to think more originally about the most basic philosophical questions. It challenges us to confront the possibility that our entire technological civilization rests upon a profound forgetfulness of being. Part 1. The Provincial Origins of Revolutionary Thinking. Martin Heidegger was born on 26 September 1889 in Meßkirch, a small rural town in southwest Germany that would profoundly shape his philosophical vision. His father, Friedrich Heidegger, was a skilled craftsman, a master cooper who made barrels, and a sexton in the Catholic Church. His mother, Johanna, came from a farming family. Heidegger's thought was profoundly influenced by the provincial environs of his youth, his conservative Catholic upbringing, and his intimate familiarity with craftwork and the rhythms of agricultural life. The world of Heidegger's childhood was a world where tools and equipment had their proper places, where human activity was intimately connected to the natural cycles of seasons and weather, where the church bells marked the rhythm of daily life. This was not the abstract, theoretical world of academic philosophy, but a concrete, lived world of practical engagement and meaningful relationships. The hammer in the carpenter's hand, the plough in the farmer's field, the sacred vessels in the church, all had their proper function within a coherent world of significance. This early immersion in a world of ready-to-hand equipment and meaningful practices would later become central to his philosophical analysis of being in the world. The young Heidegger initially prepared for the priesthood, following a path that seemed natural for a bright boy from a devout Catholic family. In 1909, after completing high school, he became a Jesuit novice, but was discharged within a month for reasons of health. This early encounter with the limits of his own bodily existence, this confrontation with finitude and vulnerability, would later resonate in his philosophical analysis of thrownness and mortality. He then entered the University of Freiburg, where he studied Catholic theology, the natural sciences and mathematics, before settling on philosophy as his course of study. A pivotal moment came during his high school years when Heidegger encountered Franz Brentano's work on the manifold meaning of being in Aristotle. By his own account, it was this work that inspired his life-long quest for the meaning of being. In 1907, the 17-year-old Heidegger asked the question that would drive his entire philosophical career: if what is predicated in manifold meanings, then what is its leading fundamental meaning? What does being mean? This question reveals the young Heidegger's intuition that the concept of being, which philosophy had taken for granted as the most universal and obvious concept, was actually deeply mysterious and in need of fundamental clarification. The question of being that emerged in Heidegger's youth was not an abstract logical puzzle, but an existential concern that grew out of his lived experience. Growing up in a world where traditional ways of life were beginning to give way to modern industrial society, where ancient religious certainties were being challenged by scientific rationality, where the meaning and purpose of human existence were becoming increasingly questionable, Heidegger sensed that something fundamental had been lost. The question of being became for him the question of what it means to exist authentically in a world that seemed to be losing its moorings. At the University of Freiburg, Heidegger immersed himself in the study of medieval philosophy and Catholic theology. In 1913, he defended a dissertation on The Doctrine of Judgment in Psychologism, a critical and positive contribution to logic, earning his doctorate in philosophy summa cum laude. This early work already shows Heidegger grappling with fundamental questions about the relationship between logic and psychology, between abstract theoretical thinking and concrete lived experience. The critique of psychologism would remain important throughout his career, as part of his broader critique of the reduction of philosophical questions to psychological or scientific ones. The encounter with Edmund Husserl's phenomenology proved transformative for the young Heidegger. In 1915, Husserl took up a post at Freiburg, and in 1919 Heidegger became his assistant. Husserl's call to return to the things themselves, to bracket the natural attitude and examine phenomena as they appear to consciousness, opened up new possibilities for philosophical investigation. But even from the beginning, Heidegger was developing his own distinctive approach to phenomenology, one that would eventually lead him far beyond his teacher's transcendental investigations. Where Husserl sought to establish phenomenology as a rigorous science of consciousness, Heidegger was drawn to the more fundamental question of the being of the beings that appear to consciousness. Where Husserl focused on the structures of intentionality and the constitution of meaning in consciousness, Heidegger was interested in the kind of being that humans have that makes such consciousness possible in the first place. This shift from consciousness to existence, from epistemology to ontology, from transcendental subjectivity to finite Dasein, would mark Heidegger's distinctive contribution to 20th century philosophy. The formative years at Freiburg were also marked by Heidegger's encounter with other crucial influences. The works of Wilhelm Dilthey introduced him to the hermeneutical tradition and the importance of historical understanding. Søren Kierkegaard's analysis of anxiety, despair, and authentic existence provided insights into the structure of human existence that would prove central to being and time. Friedrich Nietzsche's critique of traditional values and his proclamation of the death of God revealed the nihilistic foundations of modern Western culture. These diverse influences were synthesized in Heidegger's emerging vision of a fundamental ontology that would excavate the foundations of Western thought and open up new possibilities for authentic existence. Part 2. The Forgotten Question of Being. Throughout his long academic career, Heidegger was preoccupied with what he called the fundamental question of philosophy, the question of the meaning of being. But what exactly does this mean, and why did Heidegger consider it so crucial? To understand this, we must first grasp Heidegger's diagnosis of the philosophical tradition and his claim that Western thought has been characterized by a fundamental forgetfulness of being. Surveying the long history of Western philosophy, Heidegger argues that being has generally been presupposed as the most universal concept, the concept indefinable in terms of other concepts and the most self-evident concept. In short, it is a concept that is mostly taken for granted. This taking for granted, however, represents for Heidegger not philosophical sophistication, but a profound philosophical failure. The very obviousness of being, its apparent self-evidence, conceals its genuine mystery and prevents us from thinking about it properly. The tradition of Western metaphysics, beginning with Plato and Aristotle, has consistently focused on particular beings, on what exists, rather than on being itself, on the fact that anything exists at all. When philosophers ask what is being, they typically answer by pointing to the highest being, whether this be the Platonic good, the Aristotelian prime mover, the Christian God, or the modern scientific conception of nature. But this approach, which Heidegger calls ontotheology, misses the more fundamental question of what it means for anything to be in the first place. It confuses being with the highest being, and thereby covers over the ontological difference between being and beings. Aristotle's demand in the Metaphysics to know what it is that unites all possible modes of being is in many ways the question that ignites and drives Heidegger's philosophy. But whereas Aristotle sought to answer this question by developing a science of being qua being, a universal ontology that would catalogue the different ways that things can be, Heidegger argues that this approach is fundamentally misguided. It treats being as if it were itself a being, something present at hand that could be grasped through theoretical investigation. It assumes that the meaning of being is something fixed and eternal, rather than something that emerges historically and needs to be continually renewed. For Heidegger, the question of being is not a theoretical puzzle to be solved, but an existential challenge to be lived. It is not something that can be answered once and for all through abstract argumentation, but something that must be continually taken up and worked through in our concrete historical existence. The meaning of being is not a timeless truth waiting to be discovered, but something that emerges in and through human existence and varies across different historical epochs. This is why Heidegger's approach to the question of being is fundamentally historical and hermeneutical, rather than systematic and theoretical. The forgetfulness of being that characterizes Western philosophy is not simply an intellectual error that can be corrected through better arguments. It is rooted in the very structure of human existence, in our tendency to become absorbed in our practical dealings with particular beings and to lose sight of the more fundamental question of what it means for anything to be at all. This forgetfulness is reinforced by the dominance of scientific and technological thinking, which treats all beings as objects to be manipulated and controlled. The result is a flattening out of the richness of being, a reduction of everything to the level of mere presence at hand. Heidegger's declared aim in Being and Time is the concrete working out of the question of the meaning of being. This project departs dramatically from traditional ontology in that it asks not what there is, nor why there is what there is, nor even why there is anything at all rather than nothing. Heidegger's question is more fundamental. It concerns what it means for anything to be at all, what makes possible any understanding of being whatsoever. This is not a question about the content of being, but about the conditions under which being can become intelligible. To approach this question, Heidegger makes a crucial methodological decision. Rather than attempting to develop a universal ontology that would apply to all beings, he focuses on the particular kind of being that humans have. This is not because human beings are more important than other kinds of beings, but because they are the only beings for whom being is a question. Only human beings exist in such a way that their own being is an issue for them. Only they have what Heidegger calls an understanding of being. This means that any investigation into the meaning of being must begin with an analysis of human existence. But this analysis of human existence is not an end in itself. It is undertaken for the sake of the more fundamental question of the meaning of being in general. Heidegger's analysis of human existence, his existential analytic of Dasein, is the preparatory stage in a more comprehensive investigation that would ultimately encompass the full richness of being. The unfinished character of Being and Time reflects the scope and difficulty of this project, which Heidegger came to realize could not be completed within the framework he had originally envisioned. Part 3. Dasein and the revolutionary conception of human existence. To approach the question of being, Heidegger introduces one of his most important and distinctive concepts, Dasein. This German term, which literally means being there or being here, becomes Heidegger's designation for the kind of being that humans have. But Dasein is not simply another word for human being or consciousness or soul. It represents a fundamental reconceptualization of human existence that breaks decisively with the entire tradition of Western anthropology and psychology. The term Dasein refers both to human beings and to the distinctive type of being that humans have. Unlike other entities, which simply are what they are, Dasein exists in such a way that its being is an issue for it. Dasein is the being for whom being is a question, the being whose existence involves a fundamental relationship to being as such. This means that Dasein's existence is not simply a matter of being present in the world like a stone or a tree, but involves an ongoing process of understanding and interpreting its own being and the being of other entities. Heidegger conceives Dasein as the destination of being, the place where being comes to presence and reveals itself. This is why an existential analytic of Dasein is central to the phenomenological ontology that Heidegger proposes. Through an analysis of the structures of Dasein's existence, Heidegger hopes to uncover the conditions under which being becomes intelligible and thereby to shed light on the meaning of being in general. Dasein serves as the hermeneutical key that unlocks the mystery of being. The fundamental structure of Dasein's existence is what Heidegger calls being in the world. This is not a spatial relationship between a subject and an object, but an ontological structure that characterizes Dasein's mode of being. According to Heidegger, existence has an essentially open character, and therefore Dasein is always already a part of the world, always already engaged with the entities and relationships that make up its environment. There is no Dasein without world, and no world without Dasein. They are co-original structures that belong together in a fundamental unity. This openness that characterizes Dasein is an ontological structure, not a psychological or epistemological one. It is not that Dasein first exists as a closed-off subject and then opens itself to the world through acts of cognition or perception. Rather, openness belongs to the very being of Dasein. It is constitutive of what Dasein is. Dasein exists as a clearing, a space of openness in which beings can show themselves and become intelligible. This is why Heidegger calls Dasein the there of being, the place where being comes to presence. Human beings are unique among all entities in that they do not simply exist within the world passively, but actively engage with their world and help to constitute its meaning. Dasein is not just open to the world, but actively projects itself into possibilities, interpreting and reinterpreting its situation in light of its concerns and purposes. Based on this fundamental openness, Dasein can maintain distance from the world, can reflect on its situation, and can exercise freedom in choosing among the possibilities available to it. This capacity for self-reflection and self-choice is grounded in Dasein's more fundamental openness to being. The primary objective of the phenomenology of Dasein is hermeneutic in the primordial sense of this word, where it designates the business of interpreting. It is through this interpretive activity that the authentic meaning of being, and also those basic structures of being which Dasein itself possesses, are made known to Dasein's understanding of being. This means that Dasein's existence is fundamentally interpretive. It exists by constantly interpreting itself and its world. Understanding and interpretation are not activities that Dasein sometimes engages in, but constitute the very being of Dasein. Dasein's interpretive existence takes place within what Heidegger calls facticity. Dasein always finds itself thrown into a particular historical and cultural situation that it did not choose. It inherits a language, a set of cultural practices, a network of social relationships, and a range of possibilities and constraints that shape its existence. This thrownness or Geworfenheit is not something that Dasein can escape or overcome, but is a fundamental structure of its existence that it must take over and make its own. Facticity means that Dasein's existence is always historically situated and culturally conditioned. But facticity does not determine Dasein's existence in a mechanistic way. Dasein exists as a projection toward possibilities, constantly transcending its current situation by projecting itself into the future. This projection or Entwurf is not a matter of making plans or setting goals, but is the fundamental temporal structure of Dasein's existence. Dasein exists by being ahead of itself, by constantly projecting into possibilities that are not yet actual. This means that Dasein's existence is essentially futural, oriented toward what is to come rather than fixed in what already is. The unity of thrownness and projection, facticity and possibility, pastness and futurity, is what Heidegger calls care, or Sorge. Care is not an attitude or emotion, but the fundamental structure of Dasein's being, the way in which all the various aspects of Dasein's existence hang together in a unified whole. Care reveals that Dasein's existence is essentially temporal, structured by the interplay of past, present, and future. This temporal structure is not something that happens to Dasein, but constitutes its very being, making possible all of its various activities and relationships. Part 4. Being in the world as fundamental structure. Being in the world stands as perhaps Heidegger's most revolutionary insight into the nature of human existence. This phrase represents not a spatial relationship, but a fundamental ontological structure that shatters the traditional philosophical framework of subject and object that has dominated Western thought since Descartes. When Heidegger speaks of being in the world, he is describing the most basic way in which Dasein exists, a way that is more primordial than any theoretical stance toward objects or any reflective consciousness of external reality. The traditional approach to understanding human existence begins with a thinking subject confronting a world of objects. This Cartesian framework assumes that we first exist as isolated minds or consciousness, and then must somehow bridge the gap to reach an external world. This leads to the classical problems of epistemology. How can we know that the external world exists? How can we be certain that our representations correspond to reality? How can we escape from the prison of our own subjectivity? Heidegger argues that this entire framework is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of human existence. Dasein is never first a worldless subject that must then establish a relationship to objects. Rather, Dasein already finds itself engaged with a meaningful world of equipment, tools and social relationships. Before we ever adopt a theoretical attitude toward objects, we are always already practically involved with things in our environment. We hammer with hammers, write with pens, drive cars, open doors, all without first having to represent these entities as objects with determinate properties. Our most basic relationship to things is not cognitive but practical, not theoretical but engaged. This practical engagement reveals what Heidegger calls the ready-to-hand structure of equipment. When we are skillfully engaged in hammering a nail, the hammer does not appear to us as an object with certain physical properties like weight, size, and hardness. Instead, it withdraws from explicit awareness and becomes a transparent extension of our bodily activity. We do not first observe the hammer and then decide how to use it. Rather, the hammer shows up immediately in terms of its function within our ongoing activity. The hammer is constituted as a hammer by its place within a network of meaningful relationships and practical purposes. Heidegger's analysis reveals that equipment always refers beyond itself to other equipment and ultimately to the purposes and projects of Dasein. The hammer refers to nails, nails refer to boards, boards refer to houses, houses refer to dwelling, dwelling refers to the kind of being that Dasein is. Every piece of equipment gains its meaning from its place within what Heidegger calls a totality of involvements, or Bewandtnisganzheit. This totality is not a collection of separate objects, but a holistic structure of meaningful relationships that is always already understood by Dasein in its practical engagement. The structure of involvements can be analyzed in terms of several basic relationships. There is the with which of equipment, the immediate tool or instrument being used. There is the in which of the context or situation within which the activity takes place. There is the in order to of the immediate purpose or goal of the activity. There is the towards this of the broader objective toward which the activity is oriented. And there is the for the sake of which that ultimately refers to a way of being that Dasein can choose for itself. This final involvement, the for the sake of which, is crucial because it forges a connection between the practical world of equipment and Dasein's existence as a self-choosing being. Every totality of involvements is ultimately grounded in some way of being that Dasein can be, whether as an academic, a craftsperson, a parent, a citizen, or any other role or identity. This means that the world is not simply a collection of neutral objects, but is always already meaningful in terms of Dasein's projects and possibilities. The world shows up as significant because it is the arena within which Dasein works out its existence. When our practical engagement breaks down, when the hammer breaks or the computer crashes, then equipment can become present at hand, appearing as an object with determinate properties that can be observed and analysed. But this present-at-hand mode of being is a derivative modification of the more primordial ready-to-hand structure. It emerges only when our practical involvement is disrupted and we are forced to adopt a theoretical attitude toward things. The theoretical stance that characterizes modern science and philosophy is thus not our most basic relationship to things, but a specialized mode that emerges under particular conditions. The world in which Dasein exists is not the universe of objects studied by natural science, but what Heidegger calls the surrounding world or Umwelt. This is a meaningful totality of relationships and possibilities that is organized around Dasein's concerns and purposes. It includes not only equipment and tools, but also other people, social institutions, cultural traditions, and historical contexts. The surrounding world is not something that Dasein constructs or projects, but something that it always already finds itself within. Yet it is also not something fixed and determinate, but something that can be modified and transformed through Dasein's interpretive activity. Being in the world reveals that Dasein's existence is essentially relational and contextual, rather than substantial and self-contained. Dasein does not first exist as an isolated entity, and then enter into relationships with other things. Rather, Dasein's being is constituted by its relationships to the world, to others, and to itself. This means that understanding Dasein requires understanding the complex web of relationships and contexts within which it exists, rather than analyzing it as a separate substance with inherent properties. Part 5. The They-Self and the Flight from Authenticity. Most of the time, Heidegger argues, Dasein exists in what he calls the mode of everydayness, or Alltäglichkeit. In this mode, Dasein becomes absorbed in the practical concerns of daily life and loses itself in what Heidegger calls das Man, often translated as the they or the anyone. This is not a moral condemnation, but an ontological analysis of a fundamental structure of human existence. The they-self represents the way Dasein typically understands itself through public norms, social roles, and common interpretations, rather than taking responsibility for its own existence. The they is not any particular group of people, but refers to the anonymous public realm of common understanding and shared practices. It is the domain of what one does, what one thinks, what one says. When we follow the latest fashions, accept conventional opinions, pursue socially approved goals, we are existing in the mode of the they. The they provides ready-made interpretations of existence that relieve Dasein of the burden of taking responsibility for its own choices and commitments. It offers the comfort of conformity and the security of being like everyone else. In the mode of the they, Dasein's existence is characterized by what Heidegger calls falling or Verfallenheit. This falling is not a moral lapse or a departure from some original state of grace, but a fundamental tendency that belongs to the structure of Dasein's existence. Falling refers to Dasein's tendency to become absorbed in its everyday concerns and to lose sight of its own existence as an issue. Instead of confronting the fundamental questions of its existence, Dasein flees into the busyness and distractions of everyday life. Falling manifests itself in three interconnected phenomena that Heidegger calls idle talk, curiosity, and ambiguity. Idle talk, or Gerede, refers to the way language functions in everyday discourse, not as a means of genuine communication, but as a way of maintaining social contact and avoiding substantial engagement with issues. In idle talk, we repeat what has been said without really understanding it. We pass along opinions and information without taking responsibility for their truth. Language becomes disconnected from the realities it supposedly refers to and takes on a life of its own. Curiosity, or nousia, represents a restless seeking after novelty that never leads to genuine understanding. It is not the wonder that Aristotle identified as the beginning of philosophy, but a superficial fascination with whatever is new, different, or sensational. Curiosity jumps from one thing to another without ever dwelling long enough to achieve real insight. It seeks distraction rather than truth, entertainment rather than understanding. In our contemporary culture of information overload and constant stimulation, Heidegger's analysis of curiosity seems remarkably prescient. Ambiguity, or Zweideutigkeit, refers to the way they obscures genuine possibilities and makes everything seem equally valid or invalid. In the realm of the they, it becomes impossible to distinguish between authentic and inauthentic possibilities, between what is genuinely one's own and what is merely adopted from others. Everything is flattened out to the same level of significance, or rather insignificance. Distinctions between truth and falsehood, important and trivial, authentic and inauthentic become blurred and eventually disappear altogether. They exercises its dominance through what Heidegger calls the dictatorship of the they or die dictatur des man. This is not a political dictatorship imposed by force, but a subtle form of social control that operates through conformity and the fear of being different. They dictates what counts as normal, acceptable, and reasonable. It discourages genuine thinking and authentic choice by making everything a matter of following established patterns and procedures. Those who resist this dictatorship are marginalized as eccentric, unrealistic, or dangerous. Yet the they is not simply an external force that oppresses Dasein from the outside. Rather, it is a structure that Dasein itself helps to maintain and reproduce. We are not victims of the they, but willing participants in its operations. They offers us the comfortable illusion that we can escape the burden of existence by doing what everyone else does, thinking what everyone else thinks, valuing what everyone else values. It allows us to avoid confronting the fundamental anxiety and responsibility that belong to authentic existence. This is why Heidegger emphasizes that falling is not an accidental feature of human existence, but belongs to its essential structure. We are always already thrown into a public world of shared meanings and practices. We learn language from others, acquire our initial understanding of the world through social interaction, develop our sense of who we are through identification with social roles and cultural models. The they is not something we can simply reject or overcome, but something we must continually work through in the process of becoming authentic. The analysis of the they reveals that Dasein always finds itself already saddled with preferences, dispositions and character traits that it did not choose. This is what Heidegger calls thrownness or Geworfenheit. We are thrown into a particular historical epoch, a specific culture, a certain family and social situation. We inherit a language with its built-in assumptions and prejudices, a set of cultural practices with their implicit values and commitments. This thrownness places Dasein in a state of existential guilt, a fundamental lack of justification for the being that it is. But thrownness does not determine Dasein's existence in a mechanistic way. Even in its fallenness, Dasein retains the possibility of authentic existence. The very fact that Dasein can become aware of its falling, can recognize the operations of the they, can feel the anxiety that reveals the groundlessness of its existence, shows that it is not completely determined by social forces. The analysis of everydayness is not the end of Heidegger's story, but the preparation for understanding how Dasein can retrieve itself from its lostness in the they and achieve authentic existence. Part 6. Moods, Attunement, and the Disclosure of Being. One of Heidegger's most innovative contributions to philosophical anthropology is his analysis of moods, or Stimmungen, as fundamental ways in which Dasein is attuned to its being and to being in general. Traditional philosophy has tended to treat emotions and moods as subjective psychological states that may interfere with objective knowledge but have no philosophical significance. Heidegger argues that this approach completely misses the ontological importance of moods as ways in which being is disclosed to Dasein. Moods are not inner psychological events, but ways of being in the world that reveal fundamental aspects of existence. Heidegger's German term Stimmung carries connotations that are difficult to capture in English. It suggests not just an emotional state, but an attunement or tuning, like the tuning of a musical instrument. Just as a musical instrument must be properly tuned to produce harmonious sounds, Dasein must be attuned to being in order to understand and interpret its existence. Moods represent different ways in which Dasein can be tuned or attuned to the world and to its own being. They are not optional extras that sometimes accompany cognition, but fundamental structures that make understanding possible in the first place. Moods have the crucial function of disclosing Dasein's thrownness, the fact that it always finds itself already situated in a world that it did not choose. Through moods, Dasein becomes aware of its own facticity, its being delivered over to itself and to its world without its consent or control. This disclosure is not a matter of theoretical knowledge, but of immediate felt awareness. We do not first think about our thrownness and then feel thrown. Rather, we discover our thrownness through the mood of finding ourselves always already in a particular situation with particular possibilities and constraints. Fear provides an illuminating example of how moods function as modes of disclosure. When we are afraid, we are not simply experiencing an inner psychological state, but are responding to something in our environment that appears threatening. Fear reveals aspects of our world and our existence that might otherwise remain hidden. It discloses our vulnerability, our finitude, our dependence on circumstances beyond our control. It also reveals the structure of our caring, showing us what matters to us by showing us what we are afraid of losing. But fear, while illuminating, is not the most fundamental mood for Heidegger's analysis. That distinction belongs to anxiety or Angst, which Heidegger regards as the fundamental attunement that reveals the true structure of Dasein's existence. Unlike fear, which always has a definite object, anxiety has no particular focus. In anxiety, we are not afraid of any specific thing, but find ourselves confronted with the sheer fact of existence itself. Anxiety reveals what Heidegger calls the nothing, not a particular thing, but the absence of any ultimate ground or foundation for existence. Anxiety manifests the inadequacy of Dasein's fallen and inauthentic self-understanding by revealing the groundlessness of everyday concerns and activities. In moments of profound anxiety, the familiar world of equipment and social roles loses its obvious significance and appears strange and questionable. The things that normally matter to us, Our careers, our relationships, our possessions suddenly seem arbitrary and contingent. This experience of world collapse is not a psychological breakdown but an ontological revelation that shows us the true structure of our existence. Through anxiety, Dasein experiences immediately the finitude of its future horizon of possibilities. It becomes aware that all of its projects and commitments are ultimately groundless, that there is no guarantee that any of them will succeed or prove worthwhile. This confrontation with finitude and contingency is deeply unsettling, which is why most of the time Dasein flees from anxiety and seeks refuge in the familiar patterns of everyday life. But anxiety also opens up the possibility of authentic existence by revealing that Dasein is responsible for choosing its own possibilities rather than simply following predetermined paths. Boredom represents another fundamental mood that reveals important aspects of Dasein's existence. In profound boredom, time seems to drag and nothing seems interesting or worthwhile. This might appear to be simply a negative experience to be avoided, but Heidegger argues that boredom reveals the temporal structure of Dasein's existence and its essential relationship to possibilities. When we are bored, we become aware of time as an empty duration that must be filled, but we also discover that nothing in our immediate environment seems capable of providing genuine fulfillment. Boredom thus reveals both our need for meaningful engagement with possibilities and the contingency of any particular possibility. Joy and other positive moods also have important disclosive functions. In moments of joy, the world appears rich with possibilities, and our existence seems meaningful and worthwhile. Joy reveals our fundamental capacity for transcendence, our ability to project ourselves beyond our current situation toward new possibilities. It discloses the world as a realm of potential fulfillment rather than mere objects to be manipulated. But joy also reveals the fragility of meaning and the dependence of our well-being on circumstances beyond our complete control. What all moods have in common is that they are ways in which being is disclosed to Dasein. They are not subjective colorings added to an otherwise neutral world, but ways in which the world shows up as significant or insignificant, threatening or promising, familiar or strange. Moods reveal that Dasein's existence is never neutral or indifferent, but always already engaged and concerned. They show that understanding and interpretation always take place within a particular attunement that shapes what can be discovered and how it appears. This analysis of moods leads to one of Heidegger's most important insights, that there is no purely objective or neutral standpoint from which to understand existence. All understanding is situated within a particular mood or attunement that shapes what can be seen and how it appears. This does not mean that understanding is merely subjective or relative, but rather that it always takes place within a concrete historical and existential context. The goal is not to escape from all attunement, but to become more aware of our attunements and more thoughtful about their implications for understanding. Part 7. Understanding projection and the structure of possibility. Understanding, or Overturning, stands alongside attunement as one of the fundamental structures through which Dasein exists and makes sense of its world. But Heidegger's conception of understanding differs radically from the traditional philosophical approach that treats understanding as a cognitive faculty that grasps objects of knowledge. For Heidegger, understanding is not primarily about knowing, but about being, not about grasping what is already present, but about projecting toward possibilities that are not yet actual. Understanding is the existential structure through which Dasein relates to its own possibilities and to the possibilities of other entities. The fundamental character of understanding is projection or Entwurf. Dasein exists by projecting itself toward possibilities, by casting itself forward into what it can become, rather than remaining fixed in what it already is. This projection is not a matter of making explicit plans or forming conscious intentions, though it can include these activities. Rather, projection is the basic temporal structure of Dasein's existence, its essential futurity, its being always already ahead of itself. Dasein exists by constantly transcending its present situation in the direction of what is possible. Understanding as projection reveals that Dasein's existence is essentially characterized by possibility rather than actuality. While stones and trees exist as actual entities with determinate properties, Dasein exists as a being of possibilities. Its being is not fixed or given, but must be continually chosen and enacted through its decisions and commitments. This is why Heidegger can say that Dasein's essence lies in its existence, meaning that what Dasein is depends on how it chooses to exist rather than on any predetermined nature or essence. The possibilities toward which Dasein projects itself are not abstract logical possibilities, but concrete existential possibilities that are shaped by its thrownness and facticity. Dasein does not project toward just any possibilities, but toward those that are available within its particular historical and cultural situation. A person born in ancient Greece cannot project toward the possibility of becoming a computer programmer, while a person living in the 21st century cannot project toward the possibility of becoming a classical Greek citizen. Possibilities are always historically conditioned and culturally specific. Yet within these constraints, Dasein enjoys a fundamental freedom in choosing which possibilities to embrace and which to reject. This freedom is not the abstract freedom of an unconditioned will, but the concrete freedom of a finite being that must choose among limited options. It is the freedom to take over one's thrownness and make it one's own, to choose authentically among the possibilities that are genuinely available rather than simply drifting along with whatever seems expected or conventional. Freedom emerges through understanding as the capacity to project toward possibilities that express one's authentic existence. Understanding always involves what Heidegger calls a forestructure or Vorstruktur that shapes what can be discovered and how it appears. We never approach anything with a completely blank mind, but always bring with us certain expectations, assumptions, and interpretive frameworks. This forestructure includes what Heidegger calls forehaving, the general background of familiarity that makes understanding possible. It includes foresight, the perspective from which we approach particular entities or situations. And it includes foreconception, the specific conceptual framework we use to interpret what we encounter. The forestructure of understanding is not an obstacle to genuine knowledge, but a necessary condition for any understanding at all. We can only understand something new by relating it to what we already understand, by interpreting it in terms of familiar concepts and relationships. This means that understanding is always circular in structure, moving from a preliminary understanding through more detailed interpretation back to a modified understanding. This is what Heidegger calls the hermeneutical circle, and he argues that the goal is not to escape from the circle, but to enter it in the right way. Understanding becomes explicit through interpretation or Auslegung. Interpretation takes the implicit understanding that guides our everyday activities and makes it explicit through language and conceptual analysis. But interpretation does not add something external to understanding. Rather, it develops possibilities that are already present in understanding itself. Interpretation is understanding coming to terms with itself, working out more explicitly what it already knows implicitly. This is why Heidegger can say that interpretation is grounded existentially in understanding as understanding comes to understand itself. The structure of interpretation reflects the structure of understanding as projection. All interpretation involves what Heidegger calls the as structure, the fact that we always understand something as something. We see the hammer as a tool for hammering, the door as something to open, the cloud as a sign of coming rain. This as is not added by thought to a neutral object, but reflects the way entities show up within our practical engagement with the world. The as structure reveals that meaning is not a property of isolated objects, but emerges from the relationships and contexts within which entities appear. Understanding and interpretation are closely connected to what Heidegger calls discourse or Rede. Discourse is not simply spoken language, but the more fundamental structure of meaning that makes language possible. It is the articulation of intelligibility, the way in which the meaningful relationships that constitute the world are structured and organized. Language emerges from discourse as its concrete expression, but discourse itself is more primordial than any particular language. Through discourse, understanding becomes communicable and shareable, allowing Dasein to exist with others in a common world of meaning. The analysis of understanding reveals that Dasein's existence is fundamentally temporal and historical. Understanding always projects from a particular past toward a particular future, working out the possibilities that are available within a specific historical situation. This means that understanding is never timeless or universal, but always situated within a particular temporal and cultural context. The task is not to achieve a view from nowhere, but to understand more clearly and authentically from the particular somewhere in which we find ourselves. Part 8. Discourse, language, and the social dimension of existence. While Being and Time is often read as a highly individualistic work focused on the isolated existence of individual Dasein, Heidegger actually provides a sophisticated analysis of the social and linguistic dimensions of human existence. Central to this analysis is his concept of discourse or Rede, which refers not simply to spoken language, but to the more fundamental structure of meaningful communication that makes language possible. Discourse is one of the basic existential structures of Dasein, alongside attunement and understanding, and plays a crucial role in constituting the shared world in which Dasein exists with others. Discourse is the existential foundation for language, but it is not identical with language. Discourse refers to the articulation of intelligibility, the way in which the meaningful relationships that constitute Dasein's world are structured and organized. It is through discourse that the understanding and attunement which characterize Dasein's existence become communicable and shareable. Language emerges from discourse as its concrete worldly expression. But discourse itself is more primordial than any particular language or set of linguistic expressions. The structure of discourse reflects the temporal and projective character of Dasein's existence. All discourse involves what Heidegger calls what it is about, the topic or subject matter that is being discussed. It involves what is said in the saying, the specific content that is communicated. It involves communication as the way in which meaning is shared and made common. And it involves making known as the way in which discourse discloses or reveals aspects of the world and of existence. Through discourse, Dasein exists not as an isolated individual, but as what Heidegger calls Mitsein, being with others. This being with is not an optional relationship that Dasein can choose to enter or avoid, but a fundamental structure of its existence. Dasein is essentially social, constituted through and through by its relationships with others. Even when Dasein is physically alone, it exists in a world that is always already shared with others, a world of common meanings, practices, and possibilities. The others with whom Dasein exists are not primarily objects of knowledge or observation, but what Heidegger calls Metasein, coexisting Dasein. This means that others are encountered primarily as fellow existers, as beings who, like ourselves, are engaged in the task of existing and making sense of their world. We understand others not primarily by observing their behavior and inferring their mental states, but by sharing with them a common world of meaningful practices and possibilities. Our primary relationship to others is not epistemological, but existential, based on shared engagement rather than detached observation. This shared existence with others is mediated through what Heidegger calls concern or Fürsorge. Just as Dasein relates to ready-to-hand equipment through a kind of caring manipulation, it relates to others through various modes of concern. This concern can take both positive and negative forms, ranging from genuine care and support to indifference and manipulation. But even negative modes of concern presuppose the fundamental structure of being with others that characterizes Dasein's existence. The analysis of discourse and being with others reveals how Dasein acquires its initial understanding of the world and of itself. We are born into a linguistic community that provides us with ready-made interpretations of existence, established ways of making sense of our situation and our possibilities. We learn language not simply as a tool for communication, but as a way of inhabiting a shared world of meaning. Through language, we inherit the accumulated wisdom and prejudices of our cultural tradition, the ways in which previous generations have worked out the problems of existence. But this inheritance is not simply a passive reception of fixed meanings. Through discourse, Dasein actively interprets and reinterprets the linguistic and cultural resources it inherits. Language is not a static system of signs, but a living medium through which meaning is constantly created and recreated. Each act of discourse involves a creative appropriation of linguistic possibilities, a way of making the inherited language one's own while also contributing to its ongoing development. This creative appropriation becomes particularly important when Heidegger turns to the question of authentic existence. Authentic discourse involves what he calls reticence, or Verschweigenheit, a thoughtful restraint that allows genuine communication to emerge. Rather than engaging in the idle talk that characterizes everyday discourse, authentic discourse seeks to bring fundamental realities to expression in language. It involves a willingness to struggle with the limitations of inherited language and to create new possibilities for expression when necessary. The analysis of discourse also reveals the essential connection between language and truth. For Heidegger, truth is not primarily a property of propositions, but a mode of disclosure, a way in which being reveals itself through language. Discourse has the power to uncover and reveal aspects of existence that might otherwise remain hidden. But it also has the power to conceal and distort, to cover over genuine possibilities with superficial chatter and conventional wisdom. The task of authentic discourse is to use language in ways that promote genuine disclosure rather than concealment. Language thus appears in being, and time not simply as a tool for communication, but as a fundamental medium through which Dasein's existence unfolds. It is through language that Dasein articulates its understanding of itself and its world. It is through language that it communicates with others and participates in shared cultural traditions. It is through language that it confronts the fundamental questions of existence and works out authentic responses to these questions. Language is not external to existence, but internal to its very structure and development. Part 9. Care as the being of Dasein and the unity of existence. After analysing the various structures of Dasein's existence, attunement, understanding, discourse, falling and being with others, Heidegger faces the crucial question of how these diverse structures hang together in a unified whole. His answer is that the being of Dasein is fundamentally characterised by what he calls care or Sorge. Care is not an attitude or emotion that Dasein sometimes has, but the basic ontological structure that unifies all aspects of its existence. Understanding care properly is essential for grasping Heidegger's overall vision of human existence and its relationship to the question of being. Heidegger introduces the concept of care through a famous analysis of the Roman fable of Cura, in which the goddess Care shapes a human being from clay and gives it life. When a dispute arises over who should name the creature, Jupiter decides that Care should possess it as long as it lives, since she was the one who first shaped it. This fable captures Heidegger's insight that care is not something that happens to Dasein, but something that constitutes its very being from the beginning to the end of its existence. Dasein is essentially a caring being, and all of its activities and relationships are modes of care. Care has a complex temporal structure that Heidegger analyzes in terms of three interconnected dimensions. There is what he calls thrownness, or Geworfenheit, which refers to the fact that Dasein always finds itself already situated in a world that it did not choose. There is projection, or Entwurf, which refers to Dasein's essential futurity, its being always already ahead of itself in its possibilities. And there is falling, or Verfallenheit, which refers to Dasein's tendency to become absorbed in its everyday concerns and to lose sight of its authentic possibilities. These three dimensions of care correspond to the three temporal dimensions of past, future and present. Thrownness relates to pastness, but not in the sense of something that is simply over and done with. Rather, it refers to the way the past continues to live on in the present, as the inherited background of possibilities and constraints within which Dasein must work out its existence. Projection relates to futurity, but not in the sense of something that will happen later. Rather, it refers to the way the future enters into the present as the horizon of possibilities toward which Dasein projects itself. Falling relates to the present, but not in the sense of a static now moment. Rather, it refers to the way Dasein becomes absorbed in its current concerns and activities, losing sight of both its inherited past and its projected future. Falling represents a flattening out of temporality, a reduction of the rich temporal structure of existence to the immediate demands of the present situation. Yet falling is not simply negative, since it is through engagement with present circumstances that Dasein works out its relationship to past and future. The unity of these three dimensions constitutes what Heidegger calls the temporal structure of care. Care is essentially temporal, not in the sense that it happens in time, but in the sense that it constitutes the temporality within which all of Dasein's activities and experiences take place. This temporality is not the abstract time of physics, measured by clocks and calendars, but what Heidegger calls existential temporality, the lived time of human experience. Existential temporality is characterized by the unity of past, present and future as dimensions of care, rather than as separate moments in a sequence. Care also reveals the essential finitude of Dasein's existence. Because Dasein is thrown into a situation it did not choose, it cannot achieve complete self-determination or self-creation. Because it projects toward possibilities that may not be realized, it cannot achieve complete fulfillment or satisfaction. Because it falls into absorption with everyday concerns, it cannot achieve complete self-transparency or self-knowledge. The structure of care thus reveals that Dasein's existence is essentially limited and vulnerable rather than omnipotent and self-sufficient. Yet finitude is not simply a limitation but also a source of meaning and urgency. It is precisely because Dasein's existence is finite that its choices matter and its commitments have weight. If Dasein had unlimited time and unlimited possibilities, its decisions would lack the seriousness and significance that they actually possess. Finitude forces Dasein to choose among limited possibilities, and thereby gives shape and direction to its existence. The acceptance of finitude becomes crucial for authentic existence, while the denial of finitude leads to various forms of inauthenticity and self-deception. The analysis of care prepares the way for Heidegger's discussion of authentic existence and being toward death. Authentic care involves owning up to one's thrownness rather than denying or fleeing from it. It involves projecting toward possibilities that are genuinely one's own, rather than simply following conventional expectations. And it involves engaging with present circumstances in ways that remain aware of the broader temporal structure of existence, rather than becoming completely absorbed in immediate concerns. Care also reveals the essential connection between Dasein's existence and the question of being. It is because Dasein is fundamentally characterized by care that it is the kind of being for whom being is a question. Care involves a basic openness to being, a fundamental concern with what it means for anything to be at all. This is why the analysis of Dasein's existence can serve as the entry point for a more comprehensive investigation of the meaning of being in general. Dasein's caring existence provides the hermeneutical key for unlocking the mystery of being as such. The concept of care thus brings together all the various threads of Heidegger's existential analysis and shows how they form a coherent whole. It reveals that Dasein's existence is not a collection of separate faculties or capacities, but a unified structure organized around the basic relationship of caring. It shows that this caring existence is essentially temporal, finite, and open to being. And it prepares the way for understanding how Dasein can move from inauthentic to authentic existence through a more genuine appropriation of its own caring nature. Part 10. Anxiety, the Call of Conscience, and the Possibility of Authenticity. The movement from inauthentic to authentic existence requires what Heidegger calls a fundamental transformation in Dasein's understanding of itself and its possibilities. This transformation is not something that can be achieved through theoretical reflection or moral exhortation, but must emerge from Dasein's own existential experience. Central to this transformation are two closely related phenomena that Heidegger analyzes in detail: anxiety and the call of conscience. These experiences reveal to Dasein the groundlessness of its everyday existence and open up the possibility of authentic self-choice. Anxiety occupies a crucial place in Heidegger's analysis because it serves as the fundamental attunement that discloses the true structure of Dasein's existence. Unlike fear, which always has a specific object, anxiety is characterized by the absence of any determinate focus. In anxiety, we are not anxious about any particular thing, but find ourselves confronted with what Heidegger calls the nothing. This nothing is not a particular entity, but the absence of any ultimate foundation or justification for existence. Anxiety reveals that all of our everyday concerns and activities ultimately rest on groundless choices rather than objective necessities. In the experience of anxiety, the familiar world of equipment and social roles undergoes what Heidegger calls a collapse of significance. The things that normally matter to us, our careers, our relationships, our possessions, suddenly appear strange and questionable. The obvious meanings and purposes that guide everyday life lose their self-evidence and reveal themselves as arbitrary constructions. This collapse is not a psychological breakdown, but an ontological revelation that shows us the contingent and groundless character of all human projects and commitments. Anxiety individualizes Dasein by cutting through the comfortable anonymity of the they-self. In everyday existence, we lose ourselves in social roles and public activities, defining ourselves in terms of what one does rather than taking responsibility for our own choices. Anxiety strips away these external supports and confronts us with the naked fact of our own existence. It reveals that beneath all the social identities and cultural roles lies a more fundamental responsibility for choosing who we are and how we exist. This individualization is not a matter of becoming isolated from others, but of taking responsibility for our own existence within the shared world we inhabit with others. The experience of anxiety is closely connected to Dasein's confrontation with its own finitude and mortality. Anxiety reveals that all of our possibilities are ultimately limited and that our existence as a whole is moving toward the one possibility that cannot be avoided or postponed: death. This confrontation with finitude is deeply unsettling, which is why most of the time Dasein flees from anxiety and seeks refuge in the distractions and busyness of everyday life. But anxiety also opens up the possibility of authentic existence by revealing that we are responsible for choosing our own possibilities rather than simply following predetermined patterns. The call of conscience represents another crucial experience that can awaken Dasein to the possibility of authentic existence. This call does not come from any particular person or institution, but emerges from Dasein's own deepest understanding of its existence. Conscience calls Dasein back from its lostness in the they-self and summons it to take responsibility for its own existence. The call is silent in the sense that it does not use words or arguments, but communicates through a fundamental mood of uncanniness, or not being at home in the world. The call of conscience reveals Dasein's fundamental guilt or schuld. This guilt is not moral guilt in the ordinary sense, arising from specific wrongdoing, but existential guilt that belongs to the very structure of Dasein's existence. Dasein is guilty in the sense that it is responsible for choices it did not make, thrown into a situation it did not choose, and unable to provide ultimate justification for its own existence. This existential guilt cannot be removed through confession or forgiveness, but must be acknowledged and owned as a permanent feature of finite existence. To hear the call of conscience authentically means to accept this fundamental guilt, and to take responsibility for one's existence despite its groundless character. It means acknowledging that we cannot escape from our thrownness or from the lack of ultimate justification that comes with finite existence. but it also means refusing to flee from this responsibility into the comfortable conformity of the they-self. Authentic existence emerges when Dasein chooses to choose itself, taking over its thrownness and making it the basis for authentic self-projection. This choice to choose oneself is what Heidegger calls resoluteness or Entschlossenheit. Resoluteness is not a matter of making specific decisions about particular issues, but involves a fundamental commitment to authentic existence as such. It means taking responsibility for one's existence as a whole, rather than simply drifting along with conventional expectations. Resoluteness involves what Heidegger calls choosing to be a self, a wholehearted acceptance of responsibility for one's existence within the limits of finitude and thrownness. But authentic existence is not a permanent achievement that can be secured once and for all. The call of conscience must be constantly renewed, and the choice for authenticity must be repeatedly made. Dasein always remains vulnerable to falling back into the they-self, losing itself again in the comfortable anonymity of conventional existence. Authenticity is not a state but a way of existing, a constant struggle to remain true to one's own most possibilities in the face of powerful pressures toward conformity and self-deception. The analysis of anxiety and conscience reveals that authentic existence involves a fundamental transformation in Dasein's relationship to time. Instead of being absorbed in the immediate demands of the present moment, authentic Dasein develops what Heidegger calls a moment of vision, or Augenblick. This moment brings together past, present and future in a unified whole, allowing Dasein to act on the basis of its full temporal existence rather than being driven by immediate impulses. The moment of vision makes possible authentic action that is grounded in one's own most possibilities rather than in external expectations or pressures. Part 11. Being toward death and the revelation of authentic temporality. The analysis of authentic existence reaches its culmination in Heidegger's profound exploration of being toward death, one of the most challenging and influential sections of Being and Time. Death appears here not as a biological event that happens at the end of life, but as an existential structure that permeates every moment of Dasein's existence. For Heidegger, understanding our relationship to death is crucial for understanding what it means to exist authentically and for grasping the temporal structure that makes all understanding possible. Heidegger begins by distinguishing between different ways that entities can come to an end. Mere things like stones or machines simply cease to function when they are destroyed or break down. Living beings like plants and animals perish when their biological processes can no longer sustain life. But human beings, as Dasein, have a unique relationship to their own ending that Heidegger calls being toward death. This relationship is not simply about the biological fact that we will someday die, but about the way the possibility of death shapes every aspect of our existence. Death is the possibility that makes all other possibilities impossible. It is not one possibility among others that Dasein might choose to pursue or avoid, but the ultimate possibility that gives urgency and significance to all other choices. Death is what Heidegger calls Dasein's own most possibility, because it is the one possibility that cannot be shared with others or delegated to someone else. While we can collaborate with others in most of our projects and activities, each person must face their own death alone. This makes death the ultimate individualizing experience that calls Dasein back from its lostness in the anonymous they-self. Death is also what Heidegger calls an unsurpassable possibility, because it represents the absolute limit that cannot be overcome or transcended. No matter what we achieve in life, no matter how successful or fulfilled we become, death remains as the final horizon that gives shape to all our projects. This unsurpassability of death might seem to make life meaningless, but Heidegger argues that it actually gives life its urgency and significance. If we had unlimited time, our choices would lack the weight and seriousness that they actually possess. It is precisely because our time is limited that we must choose carefully among the possibilities available to us. Most of the time, however, Dasein relates to death in inauthentic ways that cover over its true significance. The they-self treats death as something that happens to others, something that will eventually happen to us, but is not relevant to our current concerns. We say, one dies or everyone dies eventually, in ways that transform death from a personal possibility into an anonymous fact. This everyday approach to death serves to tranquilize anxiety and allow us to continue with our normal activities without confronting the fundamental finitude of our existence. The they-self also encourages what Heidegger calls fleeing from death through various forms of distraction and denial. We immerse ourselves in work, entertainment, social activities, anything that will prevent us from confronting the reality of our own mortality. We develop elaborate theories about afterlife or reincarnation that promise to overcome the finality of death. We focus obsessively on health and safety measures designed to postpone death as long as possible. All of these strategies represent attempts to avoid the anxiety that comes with authentic confrontation with our own finitude. Authentic being towards death involves what Heidegger calls running ahead or anticipation of death. This does not mean dwelling morbidly on death or seeking to hasten its arrival, but rather accepting death as the ultimate horizon that gives shape to all our possibilities. When we authentically anticipate death, we recognize that all our projects and commitments are ultimately groundless and contingent. This recognition might seem to lead to nihilism or despair, but Heidegger argues that it actually liberates us to choose our possibilities more authentically. The anticipation of death reveals what Heidegger calls the thrownness that characterizes all human existence. We find ourselves thrown into existence without our consent, inheriting a particular historical situation, culture, and set of possibilities that we did not choose. We are thrown toward death as the ultimate possibility that we cannot avoid or control. But authentic anticipation of death allows us to take over this thrownness and make it the basis for our own authentic choices, rather than simply being victimized by circumstances beyond our control. Being toward death also reveals the authentic temporal structure of human existence. Instead of treating time as an infinite sequence of present moments, authentic temporality understands the past, present, and future as unified dimensions of care. The past lives on in the present as the inherited background of our situation. The future enters into the present as the horizon of possibilities toward which we project ourselves. And the present becomes the moment of decision in which we take responsibility for our entire temporal existence. This unified temporal structure makes possible what Heidegger calls historical existence. Authentic Dasein does not simply live in the present, but understands itself as part of an ongoing historical process that stretches from the past into the future. It takes over its inherited cultural traditions not as dead weight from the past, but as living possibilities that can be creatively appropriated and transformed. It projects toward future possibilities not as escape from the present, but as ways of working out more authentically the implications of its inherited situation. The analysis of being toward death thus brings together all the major themes of Heidegger's existential analysis. It shows how anxiety, conscience, resoluteness, and authentic temporality are all interconnected structures that belong to the unified phenomenon of care. It reveals that authentic existence involves accepting rather than fleeing from the fundamental structures of finitude, thrownness, and mortality that characterize human existence. And it prepares the way for understanding how individual authentic existence connects to broader questions about history, culture, and being itself. Part 12. The turn and the transformation of Heidegger's thinking. Around 1930, several years after the publication of Being and Time, Heidegger's thinking underwent what he called a turn, or kehre, that would fundamentally reshape his philosophical project. This turn was not a rejection of his earlier work, but rather a deepening and transformation of his approach to the question of being. Where Being and Time had approached being through an analysis of human existence, the later Heidegger increasingly focused on being itself and its historical self-revelation. This shift reflects Heidegger's growing conviction that the question of being could not be adequately addressed through a philosophical anthropology, however sophisticated. The turn involved a reversal of perspective from Dasein to being itself. While Being and Time had analyzed the structures of human existence in order to shed light on the meaning of being, the later work investigates how being reveals itself historically and how human existence must be understood in terms of its relationship to these historical revelations of being. This does not mean that Heidegger abandoned his interest in human existence, but rather that he came to see human existence as fundamentally constituted by its response to the historical self-disclosure of being. Humans do not primarily relate to being. Being relates to itself through humans. This transformation was motivated partly by Heidegger's recognition that Being and Time remained trapped within the metaphysical tradition it sought to overcome. The very project of developing a fundamental ontology based on the analysis of Dasein still assumed that being could be grasped through systematic philosophical analysis. But Heidegger came to believe that being is not something that can be captured in concepts or represented in theories. Being gives itself historically through what he calls epochs or sendings that cannot be predicted or controlled by human thinking. The task of thinking is not to master being, but to respond appropriately to its historical self-revelation. The later Heidegger increasingly emphasized the importance of language as the medium through which being reveals itself. Language is not primarily a tool that humans use to communicate about the world, but the realm in which being comes to presence and makes itself known. This leads to a fundamental shift in Heidegger's approach to philosophical method. Instead of developing systematic analyses of existential structures, he increasingly turns to careful interpretation of key words and texts, especially from the pre-Socratic philosophers and German poets like Hölderlin. Through this interpretive work, Heidegger seeks to uncover the ways being has revealed itself in different historical epochs. Central to the later work is Heidegger's account of the history of being as a sequence of distinct epochs or ages. Each epoch is characterized by a particular understanding of what it means for entities to be. The ancient Greeks experienced being as presence or enduring, coming forth into unconcealment. Medieval Christianity understood being in terms of creation by an omnipotent God. The modern age interprets being in terms of objectivity and representability. And the contemporary technological age reveals being as resource or standing reserve available for human manipulation and control. Each of these epochs represents a different sending of being, a different way in which being gives itself to human understanding. These sendings are not arbitrary human constructions, but ways in which being itself chooses to reveal or conceal itself. Humans do not control these historical transformations, but must learn to respond appropriately to whatever understanding of being predominates in their historical epoch. This means that thinking becomes essentially historical and receptive rather than systematic and controlling. The contemporary technological epoch receives particular attention in Heidegger's later work as representing both the culmination and the potential overcoming of Western metaphysics. Technology reveals being in the mode of what Heidegger calls enframing or Gestell, a way of understanding that treats all entities, including humans, as resources to be optimized and controlled. This technological understanding achieves unprecedented power and scope, extending its influence across the entire globe and into every aspect of human existence. But this very extremity also contains the possibility of awakening us to what has been lost and opening up new possibilities for thinking and dwelling. The turn also involves a shift in Heidegger's understanding of the relationship between thinking and action. While being and time had emphasized the importance of resoluteness and authentic choice, the later work emphasizes what Heidegger calls releasement or Gelassenheit. This involves a kind of patient waiting and receptive openness to whatever being chooses to reveal, rather than attempting to force being into predetermined conceptual frameworks. Releasement does not mean passivity or indifference, but rather a more thoughtful and responsive form of engagement that allows being to show itself on its own terms. This emphasis on receptivity and waiting has led some critics to argue that Heidegger's later philosophy becomes politically quietistic and socially irrelevant. But Heidegger would argue that truly radical transformation must begin with a fundamental change in our understanding of being rather than with political or social reforms that leave the underlying metaphysical framework intact. Only by preparing for a new understanding of being can we hope to overcome the technological nihilism that threatens to reduce everything to mere resource for human manipulation. The apparently passive stance of releasement is actually preparation for a more fundamental transformation than any merely political revolution could achieve. The turn thus represents both a continuation and a deepening of Heidegger's original project. The question of being remains central, but the approach to this question becomes more historical, more linguistic, and more receptive. Instead of seeking to develop a systematic fundamental ontology, Heidegger seeks to prepare for new possibilities of thinking that might emerge from a more originary relationship to being. This preparation involves both a destructive critique of the metaphysical tradition and a creative retrieval of more primordial possibilities for thought and existence. Part 13. The question concerning technology and the danger of enframing. Perhaps no aspect of Heidegger's later philosophy has proven more influential and controversial than his analysis of technology and its relationship to the destiny of Western civilization. In his famous essay, The Question Concerning Technology, Heidegger argues that the essence of technology is nothing technological, meaning that we cannot understand technology properly by focusing on particular machines or techniques. Instead, we must examine technology as a way of revealing being, a fundamental orientation toward the world that shapes how entities appear and what they mean. This approach allows Heidegger to diagnose what he sees as the spiritual crisis of the modern age and to point toward possibilities for renewal. Heidegger begins by distinguishing between technology as a human activity and what he calls the essence of technology. When we focus on technology as an activity, we tend to see it in instrumental terms as a means for achieving human ends. We ask questions about efficiency, effectiveness, and control, treating technology as a neutral tool that can be used for good or ill depending on human intentions. But this instrumental understanding, while not incorrect, remains superficial because it fails to grasp the deeper transformation in our understanding of being that technology represents. The essence of modern technology is what Heidegger calls enframing or Gestell. Enframing is a way of revealing that challenges everything in nature and history to show itself as standing reserve or Bestand, as resources available for human use and manipulation. This is not simply a matter of how we think about things, but a fundamental transformation in how things appear to us and what they are understood to be. Under the regime of enframing, forests become timber reserves, rivers become sources of hydroelectric power, mountains become mining sites, and even humans become human resources to be optimized and managed. This technological revealing differs fundamentally from earlier ways in which being has revealed itself throughout history. Ancient Greek craftsmen worked with materials in ways that allowed the natural properties of wood, stone, or metal to show themselves and be brought forth into beautiful and useful objects. Medieval farmers collaborated with natural processes, working with the rhythms of seasons and weather to cultivate crops and raise animals. Modern technology, by contrast, forces nature to deliver energy and resources on demand, storing them in readily available forms that can be called upon whenever needed. The difference can be illustrated by contrasting a traditional windmill with a modern wind farm. The old windmill was built to take advantage of wind when it was naturally available, grinding grain in harmony with natural rhythms and cycles. The modern wind turbine, however, is designed to extract maximum energy from wind patterns that have been scientifically analyzed and predicted, feeding electricity into a power grid that must deliver energy on demand regardless of natural variations. The wind is no longer encountered as a natural force to be worked with, but as an energy resource to be captured and controlled. Enframing represents the culmination of the Western metaphysical tradition that began with Plato's understanding of being in terms of permanent presence. Throughout this tradition, thinking has been oriented toward achieving mastery and control over beings, treating them as objects to be grasped, analyzed and manipulated. Modern science and technology represent the most complete realization of this project, achieving unprecedented power to predict and control natural processes. But this very success conceals a fundamental danger, the forgetting of being itself in favor of total preoccupation with the manipulation of beings. The danger of enframing is not primarily environmental, though Heidegger is certainly concerned about the destruction of nature. The deeper danger is spiritual, the reduction of all relationships to instrumental calculations of efficiency and control. When enframing becomes the dominant way of revealing, humans themselves are revealed as human resources rather than as the kind of beings for whom being is a question. We begin to understand ourselves in terms of our productive capacity, our utility for achieving predetermined goals, our value as components in larger technological systems. This technological understanding of human existence manifests itself in contemporary phenomena like the quantified self-movement, where people track and optimize their daily activities for maximum productivity and efficiency. It appears in educational systems that focus primarily on producing workers with marketable skills rather than fostering genuine understanding and wisdom. It dominates business and government planning that treats human communities as collections of human capital to be allocated for maximum economic output. In all these cases, what Heidegger calls the essence of man as the shepherd of being is forgotten in favor of treating humans as sophisticated animals or complex machines. Yet Heidegger also sees in the technological age the possibility of salvation. He quotes the poet Hölderlin, "Where the danger is, there grows also what saves." The very extremity of technological enframing might awaken us to what we have lost and open up possibilities for a more originary relationship to being. As technology becomes increasingly autonomous and all-encompassing, it may become impossible to maintain the illusion that humans are in control of the process. This could lead to a fundamental crisis that opens up space for new ways of thinking and dwelling. The overcoming of enframing cannot be achieved through rejecting technology or returning to pre-modern ways of life. Technology has become too deeply embedded in the structure of modern existence to be simply abandoned. Instead, Heidegger calls for developing a new relationship to technology that he describes as free relation or releasement. This involves using technological devices when appropriate, while remaining aware that technology is only one possible way of revealing being among others. It means maintaining openness to other possibilities for understanding and dwelling that technological thinking tends to close off. This free relation to technology requires what Heidegger calls a new kind of thinking that is neither purely scientific nor purely humanistic, but opens up possibilities that have been concealed by the technological understanding of being. This thinking cannot be programmed or systematized, but must emerge creatively from sustained reflection on the essence of technology and its relationship to the history of being. It requires patience, receptivity, and willingness to question the most basic assumptions of our technological civilization. Only through such thinking can we hope to prepare for new possibilities of human dwelling that go beyond the alternatives of technological domination or romantic escapism. Part 14. Truth as Aletheia and the Overturning of Metaphysics. One of Heidegger's most radical and influential innovations concerns his revolutionary understanding of truth. Throughout the Western philosophical tradition, truth has been understood primarily in terms of correspondence between statements and facts, or coherence among beliefs within a systematic framework. Heidegger argues that both of these approaches miss the more fundamental phenomenon of truth as aletheia, a Greek word that he interprets as unconcealment or unhiddenness. This interpretation allows him to develop a completely different understanding of what it means for something to be true and how truth relates to being and human existence. The traditional correspondence theory holds that a statement is true when it accurately represents some fact about the world. This seems obvious and commonsensical. When we say, "the cat is on the mat," this statement is true if and only if there actually is a cat on the mat. But Heidegger argues that this approach presupposes a more fundamental kind of truth that makes correspondence possible in the first place. Before we can compare statements to facts, there must be some prior disclosure or unconcealment that allows both the statement and the fact to appear as what they are. Truth as correspondence depends upon truth as unconcealment. Heidegger finds support for this interpretation in his analysis of the Greek word aletheia, which he breaks down as a meaning not and lethe meaning hiddenness or concealment. Truth is thus literally unconcealment, the process by which things emerge from hiddenness into the open space of appearance. This suggests that truth is not primarily a property of statements, but an event or happening in which beings show themselves as what they are. Truth is the opening up of a space in which entities can appear and be encountered in their being. This understanding of truth as unconcealment reveals that truth always involves a complex interplay between revealing and concealing. When something is brought into unconcealment, other things necessarily remain concealed or fade into the background. The process of unconcealment is selective and perspectival, illuminating some aspects of beings while leaving others in shadow. This means that truth is never complete or final, but always involves an ongoing struggle between concealment and unconcealment, hiddenness and disclosure. Every truth carries with it the possibility of untruth, not as simple error, but as the concealment that necessarily accompanies every unconcealment. The analysis of truth as aletheia also reveals the essential connection between truth and human existence. Unconcealment does not happen automatically, but requires the kind of being that can be open to being, namely Dasein. Humans are the there of being, the place where being can come into unconcealment and show itself as what it is. This does not mean that humans create truth through their thinking or willing, but rather that they provide the essential opening in which truth can happen. Truth is neither purely objective nor purely subjective, but emerges from the encounter between being and the kind of being that can be open to being. Language plays a crucial role in the happening of truth as unconcealment. It is through language that beings are first named and brought into the open space of human understanding. But language is not simply a tool that humans use to represent reality. It is the medium in which being reveals itself and becomes accessible to thought. Poetic language, in particular, has the power to open up new worlds of meaning by naming beings in ways that allow them to show themselves more originally. This is why Heidegger pays so much attention to the language of poets like Hölderlin, Rilke and Trakl. Works of art provide another important site for the happening of truth as unconcealment. In his essay, The Origin of the Work of Art, Heidegger analyzes Van Gogh's painting of peasant shoes to show how art can reveal the truth of equipment in ways that ordinary use cannot. The painting allows us to see the shoes not simply as useful objects, but as embodying an entire world of rural life with its rhythms of work and rest, its connection to the earth, its participation in the cycles of nature. Art opens up worlds by bringing to unconcealment aspects of existence that are normally taken for granted or overlooked. The understanding of truth as aletheia leads to a fundamental critique of the scientific and technological approach to truth that dominates modern culture. Science seeks to eliminate the perspectival and contextual aspects of truth in favor of universal and objective knowledge that is valid everywhere and always. But this approach necessarily involves a kind of violence, forcing beings to show themselves only in ways that can be measured, calculated and controlled. Scientific truth, while valuable within its own domain, covers over other possibilities for unconcealment that might reveal different and equally valid aspects of being. Heidegger's analysis suggests that the technological age represents a particular epoch in the history of truth, characterized by the dominance of what he calls correctness over more originary forms of aletheia. In this epoch, truth becomes primarily a matter of accurate representation and effective control, rather than receptive openness to being. This leads to enormous gains in predictive power and technological capability, but also to a kind of spiritual impoverishment, as other dimensions of truth are forgotten or dismissed as merely subjective. The challenge is to develop ways of thinking that can incorporate the achievements of science and technology while remaining open to other possibilities for truth and being. The recovery of truth as aletheia requires what Heidegger calls a more originary thinking that goes back behind the metaphysical tradition to recover more fundamental possibilities. This thinking cannot be simply rational or systematic, but must be open to the poetic, the artistic, and the mystical dimensions of human experience. It must be willing to dwell with questions rather than rushing toward answers, to think in ways that allow being to show itself, rather than forcing it into predetermined categories. This kind of thinking prepares for new possibilities of truth that might emerge in a post-metaphysical age. The implications of this understanding of truth extend far beyond academic philosophy to influence fields like literary criticism, theology, psychology, and political theory. If truth is unconcealment rather than correspondence, then the task of thinking becomes more receptive and interpretive, focused on allowing meanings to emerge rather than imposing predetermined frameworks. This has led to new approaches to textual interpretation, therapeutic practice, and political analysis that emphasize dialogue, understanding, and the creative emergence of meaning rather than control and manipulation. The understanding of truth as aletheia thus opens up possibilities for more humane and thoughtful approaches to human relationships and social problems. Part 15. Language as the house of being and the power of poetry. In Heidegger's later philosophy, language assumes a central role that goes far beyond its traditional understanding as a tool for communication or representation. Language becomes what Heidegger calls the house of being, the dwelling place where being comes to presence and reveals itself to human understanding. This metaphor suggests that language is not something humans possess and use, but rather something that possesses and uses humans, providing the fundamental medium within which all thinking and existing takes place. Understanding language properly becomes crucial for understanding both being and human existence. The traditional approach to language treats it as a system of signs or symbols that humans use to represent objects and communicate thoughts. On this view, language is essentially instrumental, a tool that can be more or less effective depending on how accurately it represents reality and how clearly it transmits information. This instrumental understanding underlies both ordinary common-sense approaches to language and sophisticated philosophical theories of meaning and reference. But Heidegger argues that this approach misses the more fundamental role that language plays in constituting the very possibilities for human understanding and existence. Language is not primarily about representing an already given reality, but about bringing reality into being through the act of naming. When language names something for the first time, it does not simply attach a label to a pre-existing object, but actually brings that object into the realm of human understanding and significance. Before things are named, they exist in a kind of darkness or concealment that makes them unavailable for human thought and action. Naming is thus a creative act that participates in the ongoing self-revelation of being, rather than simply describing what is already there. This creative power of language is most evident in poetry, which Heidegger regards as the most originary form of language. While ordinary language tends to become conventional and automatic, poetic language renews the power of naming by using words in fresh and unexpected ways. Poetry can bring hidden aspects of existence into unconcealment, opening up new possibilities for understanding and dwelling. This is why Heidegger devotes so much attention to poets like Hölderlin, whom he regards as having particular insight into the essence of language and its relationship to being. Hölderlin's poetry is especially important for Heidegger because it reflects on the historical situation of modernity and the possibility of new forms of dwelling in a technological age. Hölderlin writes about the flight of the gods and the spiritual poverty of modern life, but also about the possibility of their return in new forms. His poetry suggests that we live in a time between epochs, having lost our connection to older forms of meaning, but not yet having found new ones. Poetry becomes a way of preparing for new possibilities of meaning that might emerge from a more originary relationship to language and being. The essence of language reveals itself most clearly in what Heidegger calls saying or sage, which is more fundamental than either speaking or writing. Saying is the gathering of being into unconcealment, the calling forth that allows beings to show themselves as what they are. This saying happens not only through human speech, but through the self-showing of things themselves, their way of coming to presence and making themselves known. Humans participate in this cosmic saying by learning to listen to what beings themselves are saying and by responding thoughtfully to their self-revelation. This understanding of language leads to a transformation in how we approach thinking and philosophical reflection. Instead of trying to develop systematic theories that capture reality in conceptual networks, thinking becomes more receptive and responsive, attempting to follow the movement of being as it reveals itself through language. This requires what Heidegger calls thinking in a new sense, distinguished from both calculative reasoning and traditional philosophical speculation. Such thinking is more like listening than asserting, more like dwelling than grasping, more like poetry than science. The power of language to shape understanding becomes particularly evident when Heidegger analyzes key words from the philosophical tradition. By examining the etymology and historical development of words like being, truth, technology, and dwelling, he seeks to uncover possibilities for understanding that have been covered over by conventional usage. This etymological approach is not simply historical scholarship, but an attempt to reawaken the original power of language to open up new possibilities for thought. Words carry within themselves the accumulated wisdom and blindness of entire epochs, and thinking must learn to hear both what they reveal and what they conceal. Language also plays a crucial role in Heidegger's understanding of human community and historical existence. We do not first exist as isolated individuals who then learn language as a means of communication. Rather, we are born into language communities that provide us with the basic frameworks for understanding ourselves and our world. Language is always shared language, carrying within itself the accumulated interpretations and values of historical communities. To exist authentically means to take over this linguistic inheritance thoughtfully rather than simply accepting it passively. The analysis of language also reveals the essential historicity of all understanding. Language changes over time, and these changes reflect transformations in how being reveals itself to human understanding. Different epochs have different vocabularies and different ways of articulating the fundamental relationships that constitute human existence. Understanding our own historical situation requires understanding how our language both enables and limits our possibilities for thinking and dwelling. This historical consciousness becomes crucial for opening up new possibilities that go beyond the limitations of our current epoch. The relationship between language and being suggests that the overcoming of metaphysics and the preparation for new possibilities of dwelling must involve a transformation in language itself. This cannot be achieved through artificial construction of new technical vocabularies, but must emerge organically from a renewed relationship to the essence of language as saying. Poetry, thoughtful etymology, and careful attention to the self-showing of things provide pathways toward this linguistic renewal. Through such practices, language might again become a dwelling place where being and humans can encounter each other in more originary ways. Part 16. Art and the Origin of the Work of Art. Art occupies a privileged position in Heidegger's later philosophy as one of the primary ways in which truth happens as unconcealment. In his influential essay, The Origin of the Work of Art, Heidegger develops a radically new understanding of what art is and how it functions in human existence. Rather than treating art as aesthetic object designed to provide pleasure or beauty, Heidegger sees art as a fundamental way in which worlds are opened up and truth is brought into unconcealment. Great works of art establish the truth of historical epochs and provide the foundation for entire cultures and civilizations. Heidegger begins his analysis by examining the circular relationship between artworks, artists, and art itself. We might think that we can understand what art is by studying particular artworks, but artworks can only be identified as such if we already have some understanding of what art is. Similarly, we might think that artists create artworks, but someone can only be recognized as an artist on the basis of having created genuine artworks. This circularity suggests that art is not something that can be grasped through causal analysis or definition, but only through a kind of thinking that allows the essence of art to show itself. Traditional aesthetics has approached art primarily in terms of beauty, treating beautiful objects as sources of aesthetic pleasure for contemplating subjects. This approach assumes the standard subject-object framework that Heidegger seeks to overcome throughout his philosophy. It treats artworks as objects with aesthetic properties that can be appreciated by properly equipped subjects. But Heidegger argues that this approach misses the more fundamental truth, revealing function of art, and reduces it to a kind of sophisticated entertainment. Heidegger's famous analysis of Van Gogh's painting of Peasant Shoes illustrates his alternative approach. Rather than focusing on the formal aesthetic properties of the painting, Heidegger examines how it brings to unconcealment the truth of equipment and the world within which equipment functions. Through the painting we see the shoes not simply as useful objects, but as embodying an entire form of life, with its rhythms of work and rest, its connection to the earth, its participation in the cycles of nature. The painting opens up a world that might otherwise remain concealed or taken for granted. This analysis reveals that great artworks operate through the tension between what Heidegger calls world and earth. World refers to the organized totality of meaningful relationships that constitute a historical epoch, the network of purposes, values, and possibilities within which a community exists. Earth refers to the material, sensuous basis of existence that supports and sustains the world, but can never be completely brought under human control or understanding. Artworks bring these two dimensions into productive tension, allowing the world to shine forth while acknowledging its dependence on the mysterious self concealing earth. A Greek temple provides another powerful example of how artworks establish worlds. The temple does not simply represent the Greek gods, but actually creates the sacred space within which the gods can be present to the community. It organizes the landscape around itself, creating relationships between sacred and profane, inside and outside, divine and human, that define the basic structure of Greek existence. The temple brings the world of Greek culture into unconcealment while also revealing the earth as the mysterious source that sustains and grounds this world. Modern art faces the particular challenge of creating works in an age when traditional worlds have collapsed and new ones have not yet emerged. Contemporary art often reflects this situation through fragmentation, abstraction, and the questioning of traditional forms and values. But Heidegger sees in some modern artists, particularly poets like Rilke and Trakl, the possibility of preparing for new forms of dwelling that might emerge in a post-metaphysical age. Such art does not simply reflect the nihilism of the technological age, but opens up possibilities for overcoming it. The truth that art brings into unconcealment is not the same as scientific or philosophical truth. Scientific truth seeks to eliminate perspective and context in favor of universal and objective knowledge. Philosophical truth attempts to grasp being through systematic conceptual analysis. Artistic truth, by contrast, is always perspectival and contextual, revealing truth from within particular historical situations and cultural frameworks. But this does not make artistic truth merely relative or subjective, since it can disclose aspects of being that other forms of truth miss or conceal. Artworks also reveal the essential role of preservation or Bewahrung in the happening of truth. A work of art cannot establish a world simply through being created. It must also be preserved and cared for by communities that understand its truth-revealing function. This preservation is not simply a matter of physical conservation, but involves the ongoing interpretation and appropriation of the work's truth by successive generations. Great artworks continue to reveal new possibilities for understanding as they are encountered from different historical perspectives. The analysis of art also illuminates the relationship between tradition and innovation in human culture. Great art works both emerge from established traditions and transform those traditions by opening up new possibilities for understanding and dwelling. They take over inherited cultural materials, but use them to create genuinely new worlds of meaning. This suggests that authentic cultural renewal cannot be achieved through simply rejecting the past or passively accepting it, but requires creative appropriation that both preserves and transforms inherited possibilities. Heidegger's understanding of art has influenced numerous fields beyond philosophy, including art criticism, literary theory, theology, and cultural studies. It suggests that the value of art cannot be measured simply in terms of aesthetic pleasure or commercial success, but must be understood in relation to its capacity to open up worlds and reveal truth. This has led to new approaches to artistic interpretation that focus on the world-disclosive function of art rather than simply its formal properties. It has also contributed to renewed interest in the social and political dimensions of artistic creation and reception. The essay on art also reveals the deep connections between Heidegger's understanding of truth, language, and historical existence. Artworks are essentially linguistic in the broad sense that they bring beings into unconcealment through their own particular form of saying. They participate in the historical self-revelation of being by creating new possibilities for understanding and dwelling. Through art, being gives itself historically and opens up new epochs of truth that transform entire civilizations. Art thus becomes a crucial site for understanding both the essence of truth and the historical character of human existence. Part 17. The History of Being and the Epochs of Truth. One of the most distinctive and challenging aspects of Heidegger's later philosophy is his account of history as the self-revelation of being through successive epochs of truth. This is not history in the ordinary sense of a chronological sequence of events caused by human actions and decisions. Rather, it is what Heidegger calls the history of being itself, the way being gives itself historically through different understandings of what it means for entities to be. Each epoch represents a different sending or giving of being that establishes the fundamental framework within which all entities appear and are understood. The history of being unfolds through what Heidegger identifies as several major epochs, each characterized by a distinctive understanding of presence and truth. The earliest epoch is that of the pre-Socratic Greeks, who experienced being as presencing or coming forth into unconcealment. For thinkers like Heraclitus and Parmenides, being was not yet distinguished from particular beings, but was experienced as the emerging into presence that characterizes all entities. This original Greek experience of being provided the foundation for all subsequent Western philosophy, but it was also quickly forgotten and covered over by later developments. The second major epoch begins with Plato and Aristotle, who transformed the original Greek understanding by distinguishing between being and appearance, reality and semblance. Plato's theory of ideas established a hierarchy between a true world of eternal forms and a merely apparent world of sensible objects. This Platonic turn inaugurated what Heidegger calls metaphysics, the understanding of being in terms of permanent presence, and the search for ultimate foundations. Aristotle developed this metaphysical orientation by analyzing being in terms of substance and accident, actuality and potentiality, form and matter. The Christian medieval epoch represents a further transformation in which being is understood in terms of creation by an omnipotent God. All entities are interpreted as entia creatum, created beings, that depend for their existence on the perfect being of God as ens perfectissimum. This epoch introduces the crucial distinction between essence and existence that will continue to shape Western thinking. It also develops the understanding of truth as the adequation of mind to reality that becomes dominant in scholastic philosophy. Despite its theological framework, medieval metaphysics continues the basic Platonic project of grounding entities in some ultimate foundation. The modern epoch begins with Descartes and reaches its culmination in the German idealists like Hegel. This epoch is characterized by the turn to subjectivity and the understanding of being in terms of objectivity for a representing subject. Descartes establishes the thinking subject as the indubitable foundation for all knowledge, while the world becomes a collection of extended objects that can be mathematically analyzed and mechanically explained. Modern science and technology emerge from this epoch as ways of representing and controlling an objectified nature. The contemporary technological epoch represents both the culmination and the potential overcoming of the entire metaphysical tradition. In this epoch, being reveals itself as standing reserve, or Bestand, as resources available for human manipulation and control. The essence of technology, which Heidegger calls Enframing, becomes the dominant way in which entities appear and are understood. Everything, including humans themselves, is revealed in terms of its usefulness for technological processes of optimization and control. This epoch achieves unprecedented power over entities, but at the cost of completely forgetting being itself. Each of these epochs involves both revealing and concealing aspects of being. The Greek understanding of being as presencing opened up magnificent possibilities for thought and culture, but also prepared the way for the later reduction of being to permanent presence. Medieval theology preserved some sense of the mystery of being, but subordinated it to rational demonstration and systematic doctrine. Modern science achieved remarkable success in predicting and controlling natural processes, but reduced being to mere objectivity. Technology provides unprecedented power and efficiency, but threatens to reduce everything to manipulable resource. Heidegger emphasizes that these epochal transformations are not caused by human decisions or historical accidents, but represent the self-revelation of being itself. Humans do not control the history of being, but must learn to respond appropriately to whatever understanding of being predominates in their historical epoch. This does not mean that human activity is irrelevant, but rather that it must be understood within the broader context of being's own self, giving historical movement. The task of thinking is to become attuned to these historical sendings of being, and to prepare for new possibilities that might emerge. The technological epoch contains within itself the possibility of what Heidegger calls another beginning, that might lead beyond metaphysics altogether. The very extremity of technological enframing might awaken us to what has been forgotten and open up space for new forms of thinking and dwelling. This other beginning cannot be planned or forced, but must emerge from a more originary relationship to being that goes back behind the entire metaphysical tradition. It requires a kind of thinking that is neither metaphysical nor scientific, but opens up possibilities that have been concealed by both approaches. The preparation for this other beginning involves what Heidegger calls step back from metaphysics and a leap into a more originary understanding of being. The step back does not simply reject the metaphysical tradition, but seeks to understand its essential character and historical necessity. The leap forward attempts to retrieve possibilities for thinking that were present in the original Greek beginning, but were quickly covered over by later developments. This involves careful interpretation of pre-Socratic texts, attention to the essence of language and poetry, and openness to ways of thinking that go beyond the traditional alternatives of materialism and idealism. The history of being thus provides the context within which all of Heidegger's later thinking takes place. Questions about technology, language, art, and dwelling must all be understood in relation to our historical situation at the end of metaphysics and the possibility of a new beginning. This historical consciousness distinguishes Heidegger's approach from both traditionalist attempts to return to the past and progressivist attempts to create entirely new foundations. Instead, he seeks to think from within our historical situation while remaining open to possibilities that transcend its current limitations. Part 18. Dwelling Thinking and the Poetic Essence of Human Existence. In his later essays, Heidegger develops a vision of authentic human existence that he describes in terms of dwelling and thinking, understood not as separate activities but as complementary aspects of a unified way of being in the world. This vision emerges from his critique of technological civilization and his attempt to articulate possibilities for more originary forms of human existence. Dwelling and thinking represent ways of being that remain open to the mystery of being, rather than seeking to master and control it through technological manipulation. They point towards forms of life that might be possible in a post-metaphysical age. Heidegger's famous essay, Building Dwelling Thinking, begins with the observation that there is a housing shortage in post-war Germany, but quickly moves to the more fundamental question of whether humans know how to dwell. He argues that the crisis of homelessness is not simply a matter of insufficient housing, but reflects a deeper spiritual homelessness that characterizes modern existence. Humans have forgotten how to dwell authentically on the earth and have instead become trapped in modes of existence that reduce everything to objects for manipulation and control. Learning to dwell again requires a fundamental transformation in our understanding of what it means to exist as human beings. Authentic dwelling involves what Heidegger calls saving the earth, receiving the sky, awaiting the divinities, and initiating mortals. These four dimensions, which he calls the fourfold, provide the basic structure within which authentic human existence takes place. Saving the earth means protecting and preserving the natural environment, rather than simply exploiting it as resource. Receiving the sky means remaining open to the cycles of day and night, the seasons and the weather, rather than trying to control all natural processes. Awaiting the divinities means maintaining openness to sacred dimensions of existence, rather than reducing everything to secular calculation. Initiating mortals means accepting human finitude and mortality, rather than seeking technological transcendence of natural limits. This understanding of dwelling is closely connected to Heidegger's analysis of authentic thinking. Thinking, in the sense that Heidegger intends, is not the same as reasoning, calculating, or problem-solving, though it may include these activities. Authentic thinking is more like listening or responding, a receptive openness to what beings themselves are saying, rather than an attempt to impose predetermined categories upon them. Such thinking requires what Heidegger calls releasement or Gelassenheit, a kind of patient waiting that allows things to show themselves rather than forcing them into conceptual frameworks. The model for this kind of thinking is found in poetry, especially the poetry of Hölderlin, whom Heidegger regards as the poet of poets. Poetic thinking has the capacity to bring hidden aspects of existence into unconcealment through creative use of language. It can open up new worlds of meaning by naming beings in ways that allow them to show themselves more originally. Poetic thinking is therefore not merely aesthetic or ornamental, but performs the essential function of keeping language alive and preventing it from becoming merely instrumental. Heidegger's famous phrase that language is the house of being suggests that authentic dwelling requires learning to inhabit language thoughtfully rather than simply using it as a tool. This means paying attention to the way words carry within themselves the accumulated wisdom and blindness of entire historical epochs. It means being sensitive to etymology and to the way the meaning of words changes over time. It means creating new possibilities for expression when inherited language proves inadequate for bringing important realities to speech. Dwelling in language becomes a way of dwelling with being itself. The vision of dwelling and thinking also involves a new understanding of the relationship between humans and technology. Heidegger does not advocate simply rejecting modern technology and returning to pre-modern ways of life. Instead, he calls for developing what he calls a free relation to technology that neither demonizes it nor treats it as salvation. This involves using technological devices when appropriate, while maintaining awareness that technology is only one possible way of revealing being among others. It means resisting the tendency to treat technological efficiency as the ultimate measure of value and remaining open to other dimensions of human existence. Authentic dwelling also requires a new relationship to tradition and history. Rather than simply rejecting the past as outdated or passively accepting inherited beliefs and practices, dwelling involves what Heidegger calls retrieving or repetition of traditional possibilities. This means going back to the sources of our cultural tradition to recover possibilities that have been forgotten or covered over by later developments. It means creative appropriation of inherited wisdom rather than mere repetition or wholesale rejection. Through such retrieval, the past can become a source of renewal rather than dead weight. The political implications of Heidegger's vision of dwelling and thinking remain controversial and ambiguous. Some critics argue that his emphasis on rootedness, tradition and the sacred has affinities with reactionary political movements that idealize rural life and reject modern democratic values. Others argue that his critique of technological rationality and his vision of more thoughtful forms of existence provide resources for progressive politics concerned with environmental protection and social justice. Heidegger himself remained largely silent about specific political implications, focusing instead on what he saw as the more fundamental task of preparing for new possibilities of thinking and existence. The vision of dwelling and thinking represents Heidegger's attempt to articulate possibilities for human existence that go beyond the traditional alternatives of religious otherworldliness and secular materialism. It points toward forms of life that remain open to mystery and transcendence while accepting the finite and temporal character of human existence. It suggests ways of relating to nature, culture, and other human beings that are neither dominating nor sentimental, but based on what Heidegger calls letting beings be. Whether such possibilities can be realized in practice remains an open question, but they continue to inspire those seeking alternatives to purely technological approaches to human problems. The essays on dwelling and thinking thus bring together many of the central themes of Heidegger's later philosophy in a unified vision of authentic human existence. They show how the critique of metaphysics and technology, the analysis of language and truth, and the meditation on art and history all point toward possibilities for more originary forms of human dwelling on the earth. This vision continues to influence contemporary discussions of environmental ethics, sustainable development, and the search for meaningful alternatives to consumer capitalism. It represents Heidegger's contribution to the ongoing human task of learning how to exist thoughtfully and responsibly in the world. Part 19. The Enduring Influence and Contested Legacy. Martin Heidegger's influence on 20th and 21st century thought has been both profound and deeply controversial. His ideas have transformed fields ranging from philosophy and theology to psychology and literary criticism, inspiring new approaches to fundamental questions about existence, meaning, and truth. Yet this intellectual influence has been complicated by his personal involvement with National Socialism and his failure to adequately address this involvement after the war. Understanding Heidegger's legacy requires grappling with both the power of his ideas and the troubling aspects of his biography and political commitments. In philosophy, Heidegger's influence has been enormous and multifaceted. His existential analysis of human existence as Dasein profoundly influenced the development of existentialism, particularly in the work of Jean-Paul Sartre, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and Simone de Beauvoir. His understanding of interpretation and historical understanding became central to philosophical hermeneutics, especially in the work of Hans-Georg Gadamer. His critique of the metaphysical tradition inspired postmodern thinkers like Jacques Derrida, whose deconstruction can be seen as a radicalization of Heidegger's destruction of ontology. His analysis of technology has influenced contemporary philosophy of technology and environmental philosophy. Beyond philosophy, Heidegger's ideas have been taken up in theology, where thinkers like Rudolf Bultmann, Paul Tillich and Karl Rahner found in his analysis of existence resources for renewing Christian thought. His understanding of anxiety, authenticity, and being toward death influenced the development of existential psychology and psychiatry, particularly in the work of Ludwig Binswanger and Medard Boss. Literary critics and theorists have drawn on his understanding of language, interpretation, and the world-disclosive function of art to develop new approaches to textual analysis and cultural criticism. Even fields like architecture and urban planning have been influenced by his vision of dwelling and his critique of purely technological approaches to human environments. Heidegger's influence has been particularly strong in continental European philosophy, where his questions and approaches continue to shape contemporary debates. Thinkers like Michel Foucault, Jean-Luc Nancy, Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe, and Giorgio Agamben have all engaged seriously with Heidegger's work while also developing critical perspectives on its limitations and dangers. His influence has been less direct but still significant in Anglo-American analytic philosophy, where his insights about intentionality, embodiment, and the contextual character of understanding have influenced philosophers of mind and language. The dialogue between continental and analytic traditions has often focused on questions first raised by Heidegger about the nature of consciousness, meaning, and truth. The reception of Heidegger's work has been complicated by revelations about his involvement with National Socialism and his expressions of anti-Semitic views. His election as rector of Freiburg University in 1933 and his membership in the Nazi Party have raised serious questions about the relationship between his philosophy and his politics. Some critics argue that there are essential connections between his philosophical critique of modernity and liberalism and the reactionary political movements that he supported. Others maintain that his philosophical insights can be separated from his political commitments and personal failings. The publication of Heidegger's private notebooks, known as the Black Notebooks, has intensified these debates by revealing anti-Semitic statements that some argue reflect not merely personal prejudice, but systematic elements of his thinking. These revelations have led some scholars to call for a fundamental re-evaluation of his philosophical legacy, while others argue that the value of his philosophical insights remains independent of his personal views and political commitments. The debate continues without clear resolution, reflecting deeper questions about the relationship between philosophical truth and personal character, between ideas and their historical context. Despite these controversies, Heidegger's philosophical questions and insights continue to seem urgent and relevant. His analysis of technology and its relationship to modern consciousness speaks to contemporary concerns about artificial intelligence, social media, and the digitization of human life. His understanding of anxiety and authenticity resonates with widespread feelings of meaninglessness and alienation in consumer societies. His critique of purely instrumental approaches to human problems appeals to those seeking more thoughtful and sustainable ways of living. His vision of dwelling and his concern for preserving the earth speak to environmental movements and the search for alternatives to destructive forms of development. Heidegger's influence on contemporary art and culture has been particularly significant. Artists, poets and musicians have found in his understanding of art as truth happening, and his vision of poetic dwelling resources for developing new forms of cultural expression. His influence can be seen in everything from abstract expressionist painting to experimental poetry to architectural projects that seek to create more thoughtful relationships between humans and their environments. Cultural critics have used his insights to analyze the spiritual poverty of mass culture and to articulate alternatives based on more authentic forms of human expression. The institutional reception of Heidegger's work has also been complex and contested. While his ideas have been enormously influential in universities around the world, there have also been efforts to limit or critique his influence based on concerns about his political commitments. Some institutions have removed his name from lectureships or prizes, while others have sought to maintain critical engagement with his work while acknowledging its problematic aspects. The ongoing debates reflect broader questions about how intellectual institutions should respond to thinkers whose personal lives or political commitments are morally problematic. Looking toward the future, Heidegger's legacy seems likely to remain both influential and controversial. New generations of scholars continue to find resources in his work for addressing contemporary problems, while also developing more critical perspectives on its limitations and dangers. The key challenge is learning how to engage thoughtfully with his philosophical insights while remaining aware of their potential misuses and implications. This requires the kind of critical thinking that Heidegger himself advocated, questioning inherited assumptions while remaining open to new possibilities for understanding and existence. Part 20. The Continuing Questions and Future Possibilities. As we reach the end of our journey through Heidegger's complete philosophy, we must ask what remains living and what requires transformation in his thinking for our contemporary situation. More than half a century after his death, Heidegger's fundamental questions continue to challenge us, even as the historical context within which he posed them has been transformed by developments he could not have anticipated. The task is neither to accept his answers uncritically nor to dismiss his questions entirely, but to think through them anew in light of our own historical situation and its unique possibilities and dangers. The question of being that drove Heidegger's entire philosophical career remains as urgent today as it was a century ago. In an age of artificial intelligence, virtual reality and biotechnology, the boundaries between natural and artificial, authentic and simulated, human and machine become increasingly blurred. What does it mean for anything to be in a world where digital technologies can create compelling simulations of reality? How do we understand human existence when genetic engineering and artificial intelligence challenge traditional boundaries of the natural and the human? These questions require the kind of fundamental ontological thinking that Heidegger pioneered, even if his specific answers prove inadequate. Heidegger's analysis of technology as Enframing has proven remarkably prescient in describing the logic of contemporary digital capitalism. The reduction of everything to data that can be processed, optimized and monetized seems to fulfill his warnings about the transformation of the world into standing reserve. Social media platforms treat human relationships as resources for generating profit through advertising and data mining. The quantified self movement encourages people to track and optimize every aspect of their lives for maximum efficiency and productivity. Artificial intelligence systems increasingly make decisions about employment, credit, and even criminal justice based on algorithmic processing of vast datasets. Yet the digital revolution has also created new possibilities that challenge some of Heidegger's assumptions. Global communication networks enable forms of human connection and cultural exchange that transcend traditional boundaries of place and community. Digital technologies can democratize access to information and cultural resources, enabling new forms of learning and creative expression. Environmental monitoring systems can help us understand and respond to ecological crises in ways that might help save the Earth. The challenge is to develop what Heidegger called a free relation to these technologies that neither demonizes them nor treats them as salvation, but finds ways to use them thoughtfully. The contemporary environmental crisis raises profound questions about Heidegger's vision of dwelling and his call to save the Earth. Climate change, mass extinction, and ecological collapse seem to confirm his warnings about the destructive consequences of treating nature purely as resource for human manipulation. His vision of dwelling within the fourfold of earth, sky, divinities and mortals offers resources for thinking about more sustainable relationships between humans and the natural world. Yet his emphasis on rootedness and place may be difficult to reconcile with the global character of contemporary environmental challenges, which require unprecedented forms of international cooperation and coordination. Questions of authenticity and community take on new dimensions in an age of global migration, cultural hybridization, and multiple identities. Heidegger's analysis of authentic existence as owning one's thrownness and choosing one's own most possibilities speaks to widespread concerns about meaning and identity in pluralistic societies. But his emphasis on rootedness and his critique of cosmopolitan uprootedness sits uneasily with contemporary realities of cultural diversity and global interconnection. How can we understand authentic existence in contexts where multiple cultural traditions intersect and where traditional boundaries of community have been transformed? The question of language and meaning becomes particularly complex in digital environments where artificial intelligence systems can generate human-like text and engage in seemingly meaningful conversations. Large language models can produce poetry, philosophy and even scientific papers that are often indistinguishable from human-created works. What happens to Heidegger's understanding of language as the house of being when machines can manipulate linguistic patterns with extraordinary sophistication? Does genuine saying require consciousness and intentionality, or can it emerge from purely computational processes? These questions push us to think more carefully about what distinguishes authentic human expression from sophisticated simulation. Heidegger's critique of metaphysics and his call for another beginning take on new relevance in contexts where traditional religious and cultural authorities have lost much of their influence. Many people today experience something like the flight of the gods that Hölderlin described, a sense that traditional sources of meaning and value have become unavailable. Yet rather than leading to nihilism, this situation might open up space for new forms of meaning-making that go beyond the traditional alternatives of religious dogmatism and secular materialism. Heidegger's vision of thinking and dwelling offers resources for this task, even if it requires significant modifications to address contemporary realities. The political implications of Heidegger's thinking remain deeply contested and require careful critical evaluation. His critique of liberal democracy and his emphasis on community and tradition have been appropriated by various forms of populist and nationalist politics that claim to offer alternatives to global capitalism. Yet his insights about the spiritual poverty of purely technological civilization and his vision of more thoughtful forms of existence also appeal to progressive movements concerned with social justice and environmental protection. The challenge is to develop political applications of his insights that avoid the exclusionary and potentially violent implications that marked his own political commitments. Perhaps most importantly, Heidegger's approach to thinking itself, his emphasis on questioning rather than providing final answers, remains valuable for addressing contemporary challenges. In an age of information overload and ideological polarization, his model of patient, receptive thinking offers an alternative to both dogmatic certainty and cynical relativism. His understanding of thinking as a form of dwelling suggests ways of engaging with complex problems that are neither purely technical nor purely emotional, but involve our whole being. Such thinking is particularly needed for addressing challenges like climate change, artificial intelligence, and global inequality that require both technical expertise and fundamental wisdom about how humans should live. The future of Heidegger's influence will likely depend on our ability to think with and through his insights, while also moving beyond their limitations. This requires what he called destructive retrieve, taking apart inherited structures of thinking in order to recover more originary possibilities. Applied to Heidegger's own work, this means neither accepting his conclusions uncritically, nor dismissing his questions entirely, but thinking through them anew in light of our own historical situation. The goal is not to become better Heideggerians, but to become better thinkers who can address the unique challenges and possibilities of our time. The complete Heidegger thus presents us not with a finished system of philosophy, but with an ongoing invitation to think more originally about the most fundamental questions of human existence. His analysis of Dasein, his critique of technology, his understanding of language and truth, his vision of dwelling and thinking all provide resources for this task, even as they require critical transformation. In a time when the very survival of human civilization may depend on our ability to develop more thoughtful relationships to technology, nature, and each other, Heidegger's call for more originary thinking remains as urgent as ever. The question is whether we can learn to think and dwell in ways that honor both his insights and the new realities of our contemporary world. In this grand philosophical journey, we have traced the arc of one of the most profound and challenging thinkers in human history. From his provincial beginnings in rural Germany to his revolutionary transformation of philosophical thinking, from his early analysis of human existence to his later meditations on technology and dwelling, Heidegger opened up new possibilities for understanding what it means to be. Whether we accept or reject his specific answers, his questions continue to challenge us to think more deeply about the nature of existence, truth, and human responsibility in the world. In grappling with these questions, we participate in the ongoing conversation that constitutes philosophy itself, the eternal human quest to understand our place in the mysterious totality of being.